the greatest commands. Spiritual leaders are to teach all believers to love God and one another. Here's Gene.
This principle is the first principle that comes from the seven churches. And this is the church in Ephesus. And we're going to look at each one of these churches, but as we do, we'll see a principle emerge. The one that emerges here is from the church in Ephesus. And you're going to have a series of categories as Jesus addresses these churches. In fact, I call this first reference the Lord's address. It's Revelation chapter 2, verse 1, the first part of the verse. The Lord's address. And this is what Jesus said to John. Write to the angel of the church in Ephesus. Now again, that raises the question, who is the angel of the church in Ephesus? That actually could be translated, write to the messenger of the church in Ephesus. I think we could also say, write to the leader, the primary leader of the church in Ephesus. Now, when we go back into the New Testament and we look at the epistles, we notice that there are two words that are used to describe the leaders in the local churches. There were elders or bishops or overseers. And those two words are used interchangeably. For example, when Paul wrote to Titus, he used these two words interchangeably. The reason I left you in Crete, Titus, was to set right what was left undone, and as I directed you, to appoint elders in every town. Now, Paul and Titus had established churches, and Paul had to go on, but he left Titus in Crete to establish these churches. And so he was to appoint elders in every town. And by that, he really is saying in every church, because in the New Testament, you have the church in Jerusalem, you have the church in Ephesus, you have the church in Lystra. You see, they were named after the towns. And so he was to appoint elders in every town. But notice, he also calls the elders overseers. As an overseer of God's household, he must be blameless. So you have these two words used interchangeably. Now, we have examples of what happened in the second century. The word overseer or bishop was used of the leaders of the churches that existed and that are mentioned beyond the New Testament. For example, you have Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, which was one of the cities we're going to look at, one of the churches. You have Clement, bishop of Rome. You have Onesimus, bishop of Ephesus. You have Ignatius, the second bishop of Antioch. Now, these are references not in the scriptures, but in the second century. And these were men who emerged out of the eldership, really, that were appointed in the New Testament. And in the New Testament, you have elder and bishop used interchangeably. But when you move into the second century, you'll find that they decided to call the primary leader of the elders a bishop to distinguish him from the other elders. For example, today we talk about a senior pastor, we talk about a primary leader in the church, a primary leader of the elders, as it were, to distinguish the primary leader of the church from the rest of the elders. And so in the second century, they used the word bishop. And you'll find that in the literature of the second and the third century. So you have an interesting situation here in terms of terminology. Now, we're going to look at a question here in a moment, and that is why didn't Jesus call them elders? Or why didn't he call them bishops? Why did he call them messengers? Just keep that question in mind. Now, let's look at the Lord's address again, and then we're going to look at the content here of this letter. Write to the angel of the church in Ephesus. And he doesn't mention the leader, but we can speculate that the primary leader of the church in Ephesus at this particular time, when Jesus was speaking to John, the primary leader was Onesimus. He was the bishop in Ephesus, but he's not mentioned. Now, a practical question, here it is. Why didn't Jesus identify these church leaders by name? And why didn't he call them elders or bishops as they were called in the New Testament record? Here's a practical answer, I think. Jesus wanted his address to apply to churches of all time, today, regardless of what their leaders were called. Whether we're called a senior pastor, a lead pastor, a lead elder, whatever they're called, Jesus wants what he is saying to apply to leaders of all time of local churches. Now, let's establish the geography. This letter was written by Jesus. Actually, John recorded it, but Jesus dictated it to the church in Ephesus. And there you'll have him. And by the way, I've had the privilege of being in Ephesus several times. If you take a look here, we have one of the main streets of Ephesus. And this is one of the great archaeological developments in the world. And they've been working on this for years, and it's amazing to have the experience of walking down that main street and to realize that when Jesus wrote this little letter, dictated this letter, and John recorded it, it was to this particular church in this particular city. And a little background on Ephesus. You remember the Apostle Paul spent 3 years in Ephesus. And 2 years he lectured almost daily in the school of Tyrannus. In fact, we could go to Ephesus, and here we have really what is considered the school of Tyrannus that has been really restructured. And you'll notice in Acts 19:10, this went on for 2 years, that is, Paul in this school, so that all the residents of Asia, both Jews and Greeks, heard the word of the Lord. In other words, Paul was in this school, as it were, and he would teach the scriptures, and people came from all over Asia. Now, what does that mean? All over Asia. Well, one thing we know is that here were these churches in these cities: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Those are the 7 churches that are mentioned. And probably what happened is that people came to Ephesus from these cities. And while they were visiting Ephesus, and this was very common, Ephesus was a huge metropolis. Thousands of people. People would come to recreate. They would come to worship, really, in the various temples. They would come to purchase different things. And while they were there, they heard about this guy down in the school of Tyrannus. His name was Paul, and he was lecturing every day. And so people came and they listened and they became believers, and they went back to these cities. Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, went back to these particular cities and started churches. And so that's how these churches actually came into being. And the Apostle John, when he was in Ephesus, before he had this encounter with Jesus on the Isle of Patmos, visited these churches and taught these churches and ministered to these people. And so now he's asked to write the letters that Jesus is dictating to these 7 churches. We have a self-introduction here by Jesus in Revelation 2:1, the Lord's self-introduction. Thus says the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. And then the Lord has an evaluation. And there's a pattern. You'll see this as we go on with all the 7 churches. There's a pattern, and here's the pattern. We have the Lord's evaluation. In this case, Ephesus. I know your works, your labor, your endurance, and that you cannot tolerate evil people. They were not tolerating the Gentiles and walking like the Gentiles lived. Also, the Lord said, you have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and you have found them to be liars. Jesus commends them. And then he says, I know that you have persevered and endured hardships for the sake of my name, and you have not grown weary. So Jesus commends them. But Jesus has a major concern. I call this the Lord's verdict. But Jesus said, I have this against you. You have abandoned the love you had at first. When Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus, he commended them for their love. But they've abandoned that love. Now, what is Jesus referring to? Well, Jesus himself, when he walked the earth, referred to the greatest commandments. When he was asked, the 2 greatest commandments, or what is the greatest commandment? He said to him, the one who came and asked that question, first, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important command. And then Jesus said this. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these 2 commands. So here now Jesus is addressing the church in Ephesus and says, you've abandoned that love. That love for God first of all and love for one another. And so the Lord gives a command. Notice the command. Remember then how far you have fallen. See, love is very important to God. How we love him and love one another. Repent. Do the works you did at first. Otherwise, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place. Unless you repent. Yet you do have this. You hate the practices of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. And the Nicolaitans were a cult that really was a serious cult of idolatry and immorality. And they were not engaged in that. But the fact is, they had abandoned their first love. And so the Lord gives a general exhortation. And he does this with each of these letters. The general exhortation is, let anyone who has ears to hear listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. And then the Lord gives a reward, a promise of rewards. Not just to the church in Ephesus, if they repented, but to churches of all time. To the one who conquers, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. And there he's not talking about salvation, but he's talking about a special blessing for being faithful, for loving God with all our hearts and our neighbors as ourselves. God commends them for a number of things, but their major weakness is they had abandoned their first love. So here's the question for reflection and response. How do Paul's exhortations to the Corinthians affirm what Jesus said to the church in Ephesus. Remember what Paul wrote to the Corinthians? And this is just our love for each other. He says, love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy, is not boastful, is not arrogant, is not rude, is not self-seeking, is not irritable, and does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And the church of Ephesus, at the time that Jesus spoke, was lacking in those things. And so the message is loud and clear to all of us. To me as a pastor, to any pastor, and it's this: spiritual leaders are to teach all believers to love God and to love one another.